All right. Well, we are back again. This is session 3 of the Nothing Human live stream Q&A. And I'm starting a little bit early because I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about something that I mentioned kind of briefly last session, where I said I would like to talk a little bit about prophecy and the nature of prophecy. And I think this applies to interpreting prophecy in general. So I'm going to try and go through this, and I'm going to go through with a representative example. So let's look at a text that you're probably all familiar with, and that's from Isaiah 7. You're mostly familiar with it probably from its quotation in the Gospels, but I want to give a little bit of a background and the context of it historically in the place where it came from in Isaiah. So it's in the time of Ahaz, who was a wicked king. And Yahweh spoke again to Ahaz, it says in Isaiah 7:10, saying, "Ask a sign for yourself from Yahweh your God. Make it deep as Sheol or high as heaven." But Ahaz said, "I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord." Then he said, "Listen now, O house of David, is it too slight a thing for you to try the patience of men, that you will try the patience of my God as well? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel." And then it goes on from there. We found out later on that the prophet Isaiah approached the prophetess. This is in Isaiah 8, verse 3. It says, "So I approached the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. And Yahweh said to him, name him Maher-shalal-Hashbaz," which basically means swift is the booty, speedy is the prey. So he didn't get the name Emmanuel, but that was the sign, a maiden conceiving a child and giving birth for the unbelieving Ahaz. Okay, so you're looking at that. Now, so one of the things to understand is that it's an unuseful sign if it's not fulfilled, at least proximately, in the life of the people who heard the original prophecy. So, for instance, Ahaz, if this is going to be a rebuke to Ahaz for his unbelief, then Isaiah is going to have to give him a sign that will be fulfilled in his lifetime, like where he can see it. Because if Ahaz doesn't see the fulfillment of the sign, you can see that that doesn't really do very much for Ahaz. And so it's important to understand then that prophecy has a proximate fulfillment. So in Isaiah's day, this prophecy had a fulfillment in the sense of a maiden, because the word for that's translated sometimes virgin there can also be translated maiden. It basically means a woman who hasn't had a child yet. And so a maiden, the prophetess that Isaiah approached, had a child. That was the sign being fulfilled in the eyes of Ahaz, potentially. But then when you get into the Gospels in Matthew and in Luke, that same exact prophecy is then referred to when a virgin, an actual virgin, conceives and gives birth to a child who is God with us, Emmanuel. So you're thinking, well, wait, hold on a second. That prophecy was already fulfilled in the time of Isaiah. And obviously it would have to have been fulfilled in the time of Isaiah for it to be of any use as a rebuke to Ahaz. So which is it? Is it that the prophecy had already been fulfilled in the time of Isaiah, or is it that it wasn't really fulfilled until the time of Jesus, which was long after the time of Ahaz, wouldn't have really been useful as a prophetic confirmation? Okay? So consider that then as you're looking into these texts, that there is usually for most prophecy both a proximate and what they call an ultimate fulfillment. So a proximate and an ultimate fulfillment is basically part of any prophetic text, both throughout the Old Testament all the way into the New Testament. So if you're looking at prophecy, say in the time of Revelation, when John gives his prophecy there, you need to understand that that meant something to the people who heard it originally. And if you look at the book of Revelation at the beginning, it kind of tells you what it's trying to accomplish there in terms of the people who originally heard the text. They were 7 real historical churches who received the letter in that postal route in Asia Minor. And it would have meant something to them. So I'm always a little bit wary when I hear interpretations of any prophetic text that refer to contemporary events as if that's necessarily the only thing that this prophecy could mean, because look how it lines up and everything like that. I think it's important to understand the first foundation for prophetic fulfillment is the original audience. It's always in the lifetime of the original audience. That would need to be the case. That would need to be the case because the original audience needs to know that they can believe the prophetic word. So consider that next time you're reading prophecy. All right, well, I am in the chat here, and I don't see anybody yet who is coming to give me questions. So I can continue on, talk about a little bit about what's going on over on the Nothing Human podcast world. So today I did a little bit of work on the Lord's Prayer, doing an introduction for the series on the Lord's Prayer. And I have a good bit of material that I have to work through. And I was just thinking a lot actually today about how to make, my mom is saying the sound is low. I am just talking probably too quietly, but I'm going to do my best. So, yeah, there's not a lot I can do about that. Sorry, Mom. Can you turn your volume up? Or not too much because I can hear it downstairs. My mom is upstairs listening to this, and so I'm getting a little bit speech jammed because I can hear my own voice like slightly after I'm saying things. Anyway, so yeah, the Lord's Prayer series is going pretty well. I've got most of the prep done, so I should be able to release the first one, the introduction, tomorrow. And I also have editing going on apace on the Truth is Not an Empty Word. If you guys have a different title for that you like better, you're going to have to let me know. But the work on that is going forward. Chase is my editor, and we talked recently, and he said that he should be able to get most of his changes done by the end of December. So we'll be seeing that. And then I have a few things that I have to add to a few appendices he wants me to write and a few extra additional parts to a couple of different chapters. So I'm going to have to do all of that work, and that's going to be a challenge for me because time is very precious right now. But everything on that is going forward. So I hope that you're doing well. I don't see anybody coming into the chat, so I may just go over to a different topic of my own choosing. But, yeah. I don't see anything. Okay. So, what should I talk about then? Maybe I'll just yell up at people upstairs and tell them to give me something. Just send somebody down here. Or I could look at one of Dan's previous questions. So Dan had asked me a couple more questions. By the way, Dan Moan, my friend and cousin who lives in Kansas City, Missouri, is one of the major reasons why I'm doing this. And he's a good dude. He's a really good dude. And he and his family asked me if I would do something like this because we had a few conversations on the phone. And he basically was like, hey, this is great and everything, but I'd really like to be able to listen back to this in order to hear it again and kind of reprocess it, because he says it's kind of like drinking from a fire hydrant or something. Anyway, so I get that. So I decided that I would do this for him and that it would be available for the rest of you as well. So yeah, that's been good times. All right. I can't find his message right now because my phone is currently recording. So this is yet another thing. I can't even remember what it was that he wanted to ask me about. He has various different questions about various different things. He recently read a book that I'm reading. I mean, it's a short book called The Israel Delusion by Dale Partridge. And it's talking about the nature of Israel, like the nation of Israel, the current secular state of Israel, and whether or not hey, look who it is. I know you texted me a few questions and subjects, Dan, but I can't find them because they're on my phone and I can't get to them right now. So you may have to write them in here again. I will wait for that. But in the meantime, I'll talk a little bit about Israel because that should make me a lot of friends on YouTube. So I think the major issue with that, and Dale Partridge talks about it, is the misunderstanding that the biological children of Abraham are actually the spiritual children of Abraham. And we talked a little bit about this last session when I talked about the seed principle, the seeds being that which reproduces after its own kind. So if you're thinking about something that reproduces after its own kind in a spiritual sense, it's important then to note that it doesn't say necessarily sons of Abraham as much as it says seed of Abraham, that the promises are to the seed of Abraham. Paul makes a huge deal out of that. So who are the seed of Abraham? Well, we know that they are not just the biological sons of Abraham. Jesus made that very clear when he talked to the Pharisees. He said to the Pharisees that they were sons of the devil, seed of the serpent. So they, even though they claimed to be sons of Abraham, he said, if you were sons of Abraham, you would believe like Abraham believed, and you don't. So you're not. You're actually sons of your father, the devil. And so in those terms, I don't think that you can just say because biologically you have descended from Abraham or biologically you have descended from Jewish stock, that means that you are the inheritor of all the promises of Israel. You could also point back and say, well, in the Old Testament, those promises, the land promises were contingent. They were conditional. They were not unconditional promises. In fact, Israel lost the land multiple times because of rebellion. And Moses made that very clear in Deuteronomy. He says that if you follow after the Lord your God and obey the commandments as you have committed to do in this covenant arrangement, then you will be living long on the land. I mean, that's the whole nature of the honor your father and your mother. But if you look through the Torah, the honor your father and your mother promise is connected actually to obedience to all the law, which the people of Israel agreed to obey, both in the original covenant arrangement that they had with Moses that they disobeyed, and then the secondary covenant arrangement that they had with Joshua, which they disobeyed, and then all the other covenant arrangements that they made that they also disobeyed. They never did what they said they were going to do on the land, and eventually the patience of God ran out, and the Israelites were ejected from the land. That happened both to the Israelites, as in the northern tribes who were in rebellion and never had a righteous king. And you see that happen in 722 BC, I think, when the Assyrians came and exiled them and, replaced them with a bunch of foreigners and kind of intermixed them, and that became Samaria. And then Judea, which is Judah, which is the lower southern kingdom, was evicted from their land in 586 BC by the Babylonians, and then again in AD 70, finally, and pretty much entirely until 1948, when a pretend people reconstituted themselves in the land of Israel. And honestly, given the fact that they have not and still do not obey God and follow after the commandments and the covenant that he set for them, they do not have rights to the land, technically, because he already said that. He already made it really, really clear. So in those terms, a lot of the land claims that are being made by so-called Israelites that I do not believe are true Israel, even though they're descended biologically, potentially, although a lot of them are mostly European Jews. I mean, there's like 3% Palestinian Jews in Israel or something, or 4% maybe. So yeah, we're not talking about a continuous people. This is a reconstituted people. Okay, so anyway, that's a really important topic, and I understand also very controversial. A lot of people would accuse anybody who makes any of these kinds of claims of anti-Semitism. I don't believe that it is anti-Semitic to hold people to commitments and agreements that they themselves believe they're part of. So, if they're part of a covenant with God, then why did they not listen to and obey and follow after God then? Why don't they listen to, obey, and follow after God now? And if they aren't engaging in that covenant commitment and actually following those covenant regulations that he set for them, then they don't have rights to say that really even they're true Israel. They are disowned in that sense. Okay. So Dan has given me a question. Thanks, Dan, for doing this. So, salvation, he says, not followed by sanctification, or may be followed by sanctification briefly. How do we reconcile family or others who claim to know Christ, but there's no fruit in their life or bad fruit? Okay. Um, I mean, that's it. It's for one. There's a couple of different things you have to think about. One, I would say you have to be careful because ultimately it is not for us to make judgments concerning another servant of God's fitness. I mean, Jesus makes this very clear. He says, "You're servants. I'm the master, and the master is the one who is going to judge a servant on the basis of whether or not he's doing what he should be doing." So that's the first thing. Secondly, though, a lot of people will hide from that, judge not lest you be judged and all these kinds of things. And they basically mean that means you can't make any kind of assessment on another person's righteousness or whether or not they're being obedient. And I don't think that's true either, because otherwise, how could you confess sins to one another? How could you rebuke one another, exhort one another? There's a reason why we're commanded to do those things. So I think it's important to recognize that as brothers and sisters, we are supposed to look after one another and rebuke one another when we find each other in sin with gentleness and with understanding and with love. But that should happen. I don't know that there's any necessity of making any final pronouncement on that, though. I mean, you could really just go and say, hey, I think that there are some issues here where you're not being obedient to the thing that you claim to be, that you say that you're a follower of Jesus. Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And I think that there are rules and commands that he's given to us that I don't believe that you're following. That's not necessarily going to go very well, and sometimes you have to approach it really delicately. And sometimes you have to approach it with the understanding that there is going to be potentially a break in the relationship. But I'll say this too, that if it doesn't hurt to do that, if it's not somewhat scary to do that, you're probably not the person that should. Because I think there are a lot of people who say, well, the truth needs to be spoken and we just need to rebuke these people who are in sin. But they don't really care about those people, so they don't fear any loss of relationship, and they don't fear hurting that other person in any way, hurting their feelings or damaging them in any way. And I don't think that if you're in that state, that you really love the other person enough to be effective in correcting them. I think if you're supposed to correct another person in love, then you have to love them. And if there isn't that feeling in you of, man, I really don't want to say anything to him because I don't want to damage the relationship, or I don't want to say anything to her because I don't want to hurt her feelings, or I don't want to make her feel like I don't care about her because I really do. Even if you have that spirit in you before you go into a conversation, I think you're actually in a better place to actually have that conversation because you are that care, that understanding, that empathy, that desire to love the other and care for the other is going to be there when you boldly say the things you need to say. And they're more likely to understand, I don't like what you're saying, but you really care about me. So that would be the way that I would say to approach that. In terms of whether or not there's even the possibility of a carnal Christian, can a person be saved without being transformed? No, well, not really. I mean, not theoretically even, because what are you saved from? If you're saved from sin and bondage to sin and freed from slavery to sin, but you're still enslaved to sin, then you haven't been saved. So I would say that it's a really important thing to say that, God's forgiveness is transforming. If you have been forgiven, you will be transformed. If you haven't been transformed, should be warning to you that you possibly aren't forgiven. So, if there's not transformation in your life, if there's not change in your life, holiness as you grow closer to Jesus, something very deeply is wrong, and I think you need to address it. So that's what I would say to that. I don't know if that's helpful or whatnot, but take it for what it is. All right, so can you teach in detail the 7 days of creation? I can look at it and I can do my best, but I will say that the 7 days of creation are kind of complicated. But I'll give you some frameworks to work through. And I don't have like a board or anything, or I'd write what I usually write. So right now, I'll just do my very best. Okay, so forgive me. Um, there is a framework in creation where if you're looking at day 1, day 2, day 3, and then day 4, day 5, day 6, and you kind of put day 7 off on the side. So you kind of have like this 3 and 3 framework. You'll see that the first 3 days are sort of the containers, and then the last 3 days are the fillings. So that would kind of help. So if you think about day 1 is where you have light and space, and then you have day 2 is where you have the separation of the heavens and the ocean, or the abyss from the heavens. And then on day 3 you have the dry land. And so if you look, okay, so now you have day 4 is the filling of heavens, which is the stars, and the light to rule, or the sun to rule by day and the moon to rule by night. And then on day 5 you have the filling of the sky and the oceans, which is the birds and the fish. And then on day 6 you have plants, I think, on day 5. But you have the land animals and humans on day 6. So it's kind of like loose framework. You can think of day 1, 2, and 3 as being the containers, and day 4, 5, and 6 as being the fillings that go, to connect to those 1, 2, 3. There's also interesting things that are connected to the way that the days are talked about, which rabbis will make a lot of, and I think should be made actually quite a lot of. For instance, day 1 is a cardinal number, so it's Yom Echad, which means day 1. It's literally day 1. I know it says the first day, but literally it says day 1. But the second day is a ordinal number. It is a second day. So the first day is day 1. There was evening, there was morning, day 1. And then on the second day, there was evening, there was morning, a second day. And then you have a third day. And then you have a fourth day. And then you have a fifth day. And then you have the sixth day. And then you have the Sabbath. So why the sixth day is given the definite article and called the sixth, and the first day is called Yom Echad, day 1. Well, for one, there's interesting things. Like, there's a lot of stuff in Genesis and actually throughout the Torah where you wonder what Moses was attempting to do or why he did the things that he did, and people have puzzled about it for a really long time. But why he said day 1 instead of the first day or a first day, who knows? But there's a lot of things that connect to it elsewhere. So for one, day 1, day 1 is Sunday. So that's important to know. We usually think of day 1 as like Monday, because that's like the quote unquote first day of the week for us. But if you think about the Sabbath was a Saturday for them, that means that day 1 is Sunday, the Lord's Day. And in the prophets, there's really interesting, and you can look it up. In one of the prophets, and I'm not bringing it up to mind, but I'll look it up and maybe I can send you a text for this. But Yom Echad shows up in other passages, and it's talking about like the eternal day of like the new heavens and the new earth, basically. And it talks about that day as being like an unending day 1, like an unending unified day, a Yom Echad. Which is really interesting because you're thinking, okay, so it's like an extended Lord's Day, and they're referring back to this language that Moses, I don't know if he knew that that's the way that was going to work out eventually, but it's still there, and it's used in the prophets in the Old Testament, and eventually becomes the Lord's Day, and eventually you can think of the unending day of the afterlife as being sort of a one day, a day 1, a Yom Echad. So that's kind of interesting. Another interesting thing about that is that the sixth day is probably called the sixth, and kind of demarcated in that way to make it more important, because human beings were created on that day. But it is also Friday, which was also not just the day that human beings were created, but also when human beings were saved, because that is the day in which Jesus was crucified. So the sixth day was both the creation and the redemption accomplished for human beings. And so, it's sort of like a very important day, and Moses marks it out as such. The Sabbath is also demarcated as a hallowed day or a holy day, a set apart day, which is one of the reasons it also gets the definite article. I don't know how much more I should do on this. I will say, like, just straightforwardly, that I'm not an evolutionist. So from what I've said so far, you can see that there are obviously literary elements to the 6 days of creation. And a lot of people will talk about how those are related to Babylonian or Ugaritic creation stories and things like that, and even Egyptian creation stories that Moses may have drawn from, because he was an erudite and well-educated scholar who was raised in the court of Pharaoh. So he probably had access to a lot of various different materials like that. And if you read the story of the Egyptian creation or Babylonian creation or Ugaritic creation, you will see some qualities that are similar, some aspects of the storytelling that are similar, and of the drama that are similar. And you can see that also with flood story and stuff like that. So there's obviously sources that Moses may have been familiar with. The question is, did he draw wholesale from them and just piece together a unique Jewish version of all of those myths? Or are they all drawing? Because that's sort of like what you see with Joseph Campbell. He'll say that there's something innate in the human being to make sense and meaning of these things, and so that's why our myths all are parallel to one another or coordinate in various ways. I don't agree with that. I think probably more than likely those stories were largely oral tradition that had been passed down over many generations and had been maintained and preserved in those various different cultures. But that, like a bad game of telephone, a lot of them had become perverted or corrupt or twisted for various different reasons or purposes, especially in those kind of totalitarian and centralized states where the creation myth and the God myths were used in order to bolster and legitimize state rule. So you can't take everything there without a grain of salt. In fact, I'd say you probably need a whole granary of salt for a lot of those things, especially considering how obviously revisionist the Egyptian chronicles were, for instance. But I think that Moses was probably drawing from a similarly connected story that had been passed down. I mean, there had been, if we take the story at face value, if Adam and Eve had been there at the beginning and had been told what had happened, then they would have passed down that story to their children, who would have passed it down to their children. And even as they migrated and, separated and divided in various different ways, they would have had similar connections to that original story. And like languages from the same root, there'd be dialects of the story and other kinds of changes that would occur, but the original kind of bones would still be there, which is why I think there are some similarities between the creation stories in Genesis and the creation stories in surrounding cultures. That would be my explanation for that. It's a valid explanation, is all I'm saying. The Joseph Campbell explanation is also possible, but I don't agree with it, and I don't think it's necessary. As far as why God organized it in sort of like a dramatic, literary kind of a way, and it almost has like a poetic kind of value to it. I mean, I think it's important to understand that history is God's outworking of his will and his story. And he is a dramatist and a storyteller and artistic, and he loves beauty and he loves a great tale. So, of course, why wouldn't he write history in a way that was actually interesting? And there are some ways that he writes history that in some ways are even more on the nose than you would even expect a fiction writer to write. I love telling about the destruction of Jerusalem. I mean, I don't love telling about this, it's terrible, but the destruction of Jerusalem that happened in 586 BC. and the destruction of Jerusalem that happened in AD 70. So in 586 BC, the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and it happened in the month of Ab. And I think in the 9th day of the month of Ab is the day that the temple itself was actually destroyed. And so the month of Ab is even still a month of mourning and lamentation. Oftentimes they'll read the book of Lamentation written by Jeremiah, who witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And so they'll read it during the month of Ab, and it's a time of high mourning and lamentation for the Jews concerning the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586. And the 9th day is like the high day of mourning in that month. Okay, well, in 70 AD, in AD 70, when the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem again and destroyed the temple, the Herod's temple, the second temple, it happened on the exact same day. The destruction of the temple actually happened on the 9th day of the month of Ab. So, like, that is... I don't know how more clear God could be that was a significant historical event that he orchestrated. But that is exactly what happened. And again, if I were to write that into a fictional story, most people would be like, that's a little on the nose, that's a little overly direct. So anyway, it's very obvious that God writes history in a dramatic and poetic manner. So he probably created the earth and the universe in a dramatic and poetic manner as well, because he's dramatic and poetic. That doesn't mean that that's not the way it happened. And there are all sorts of various ways that people would be like, yeah, but there was the sun after there was light. So how was the light contained if there was no sun? Well, even from a scientific perspective, the idea of uncollected or energy is obviously a thing. If space and itself is being stretched out, there's a sense in which you're gonna have uncollected and organized energy. I mean, for instance, they talk about like the hydrostatic equilibrium, which is when things form into spheres, and that doesn't happen if there's too much of a spread, if the spread is too fast or if it's too slow. And so things like that, you'd say, well, the sun could have formed after the universe had been stretched out and in its particular way. And that, anyway, all I'm saying is there's no particular scientific reason why that thing couldn't happen in that particular way. And a lot of people will point at that. They'll point at distant starlight or other things like that. But again, if you're talking about space itself being stretched out, you're not really talking about Newtonian mechanics at that point. Especially if you take the inflationary model of the Big Bang and you're talking about the universe reaching most of the size that it currently has in under a second. You have the uniformity of cosmic background radiation, which indicates that it was all mixed together even like early on, and that it hasn't been traveling through all those spaces and continuing to mix. So it's like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The thing is that, like, scientifically, you don't have to hold to any of those things. It's not necessary to believe. And so I don't, because I think that actually not only do the scriptures provide a good enough account that has evidenced itself enough in science and history, but also it's made predictions that I think are better and easier to hold to. For instance, when we sent out our satellites out into the distant like planets in this particular solar system, we expected that all those planets and their moons would be totally dead, that they would not have any geothermal activity, that any dust rings or other things like that would have already coalesced and been pulled down through the gravitational forces of those particular planets. And instead, when they went out there, they expected to find dead planets and dead moons, and they found crazy living planets. I mean, they had geothermal activity in almost all of them, including volcanic activity and continued heat from the initial formation of all the planets. They had water geysers on Enceladus and other kinds of geoactive events happening regularly. They found rings on Jupiter that should have already coalesced. They found, and even the rings of Saturn are sort of a mystery. They don't know how those haven't already been drawn into Saturn. And the runaway atmosphere of Mars, which is continually shrinking. And yet it's like, Look, if it's been shrinking at its current rate, if it's been, like, because it's going the opposite direction. Venus has a runaway greenhouse atmosphere where it's so thick that the surface temperature of Venus is actually hotter than Mercury, even though Mercury is way closer to the sun. And Earth has a perfect atmosphere that's basically stable, and Mars has the opposite direction, where the atmosphere is actually disappearing. The atmosphere is getting thinner over time. But you think, how long would it take for a runaway atmosphere that's getting thinner over time to eventually disappear? Why is there still any atmosphere left on Mars? And so all of those things would be things that a young Earth model, a young universe model, would have predicted. That all of those things would have been predicted by that model. All of those things not only weren't predicted by the long age evolutionary perspective, but aside from that, they don't even know how to explain them. If you're talking about 15 billion years, they don't know how to explain how all those things are not already completed. And there are other things, like rotten T-Rex bones and other things like that actually do, have physical evidences of a much more compressed time frame. You also have people like, that are called kooks and crazy people like Graham Hancock going around saying, hey, ancient civilizations actually are quite advanced. His timeline might be completely off, but the reality is that most archaeologists are creating a linear perspective on the development of mankind from apes to cavemen to advanced civilizations that does not match the data. It just doesn't. So with all those things in mind, I basically, and I did philosophy of science. I'd forgotten a lot of what I learned, but I did do a huge amount of study in philosophy of science and in science in general, and I just was never convinced by any of it. It all felt like special pleading. So anyway, if that is anything you want to know as well, that's one of the reasons why I continue to not hold to macroevolutionary ideas. Microevolutionary ideas I do hold to, in the idea of like natural selection. Natural selection is just like boneheadedly simple and straightforward and obvious, and actually the scriptures necessitates it, because if Noah brought a bunch of kinds onto the ark, that doesn't mean he brought every single species that currently exists, but rather that there has been speciation, narrowing of genetic codes through migration and interbreeding over the course of a period of time, which is what natural selection is, and that is obvious and clear. I mean, I don't think I don't think any creationist disagrees with that. But the idea that would actually create not just narrowing genetic information, but broadening genetic information is actually absurd. It's never happened. Nobody believes that. I certainly don't. It's never been tested. It's never been evidenced. It's never been seen. Okay, so that's what I've got as far as the creation from Genesis. And there's a lot more to talk about there. For instance, what Moses particularly thought about various different things that he wrote. That's a question. Augustine actually talks about it a lot. And if you've read book 12 of Augustine's Confessions, he talks extensively about some of the phrases in Genesis and wonders whether or not Moses even had any idea what he was talking about. Like... I'll give you one example if I haven't already talked to you about it. I know I've talked to some of you about it, but Moses chooses a word when he talks about the making of Eve. The word in Hebrew is bana, which is then translated into the Greek and Septuagint as oikomeneo, which literally means house build. So oikos is house and meneo is build. So it literally means to build a house, and bana is the Hebrew word that does mean build, as in I built a house. And so it says that God built Eve out of the side of Adam. So if you're looking at that, if you're considering like, why would he use that word? And you think, you just got to go back and like think Moses was writing this scroll, and he's got his pen, he's writing the scroll, and he's thinking, what word do I use here? I could write form, like pottery, or I could say create. like I did with the heavens and the earth, or even with Adam. Or I could talk about maybe shape, or even make, just the word make. I could use any of those various different words. But then he settles on the word build, and he's just like, apparently he was like, yeah, that's right. He built her, like a house. So Eve was like literally a brick house, I guess, like the song says. But what's interesting about that is look at the picture that's being made. Adam, the first Adam, is put into a deep sleep, a tardema, like a sleep of death, and he is wounded in his side, and from the wounded side is built a woman who is like a house, edified into his bride. And then you're like, okay, well, Moses could not have possibly thought that word oikomeneo would eventually be used to say, that when Jesus says, I will build my church, he uses that same word. And the idea of edifying then becomes like, I will edify my church. I will build up, I will house build up my church to be a righteous bride for me. And it was Jesus in death, wounded in his side, and the water and the blood which comes from that. We are born of the water and the blood, and built from the water and the blood as a house, as a wife, a house-built wife that is his proper and true companion, bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. So it's a really fascinating idea that Moses chose that word and created a huge amount of theology from that one word choice. And I have no idea whether he knew that that's what would be sprung from that, whether that's what God would do with it. So that's there are all sorts of those various different details in Moses' writing. Moses was obviously a prophet. I mean, he was kind of the prophet originally, and but he's a brilliant dude. Like that, there's so much richness in the Torah to be explored because of those kinds of details and those kinds of choices. And because he's so careful, it kind of feels like no specific detail wouldn't warrant investigation. You know what I mean? Where you're just like looking at it and you're like, well, if a single word or a single definite article or any of these things could render such riches, like, when you see a little bit of an odd construction or an odd word, or, the fact, for instance, that he mentions that Abraham had 318 men, that he took with him to battle against, to rescue Lot, right? It says he has 318 men. And you're like, why does Moses mention 318? Why not just give us a round number or something? Why the exact number? And there's a lot of speculation about that, as you might imagine, because you're like, with Moses being so careful and being so detailed and throwing all these Easter eggs in there, there's probably something to it. So there's a lot of that. I can tell you a little bit about that. I mean, maybe you're curious. Okay, so 318 is the number that the letters of the name Eleazar add up to. So if you know anything about the Hebrew language, they didn't have like Arabic numerals; those weren't around yet. So they actually use the alphabet as numbers as well. So what that means then is that each word has a number, because you can count up what each of those letters number is, and then you add them all together. In fact, the word scribe, which is in Hebrew sephar, so the sepharim are the scribes, that means to count. They're called counters, and the reason they're called counters is because whenever they would do a copy of a manuscript, the head scribe had the secret number of the addition of all the letters on that page. So he would go through that page and, they would have the official count where you'd have like 10 or 15 people all count the letters and all add them all up. And they'd have this special number for that page that was meant to be copied. And he would keep in his desk or in his drawer or whatever secretly all the secret numbers for every page of every manuscript that was meant to be copied. And every section had its own secret number. And so when the scribe came in after having made a copy, if they came in, they would say, here's the number of my page that I counted of all the letters that were on this page. And if it didn't match the secret number that the head scribe had, they would destroy the page. The copy was not accepted, and they would actually have to destroy it. They would cut and burn it, just to make sure that no corrupt text was put out into the world. So that's one of the reasons why scribes were called counters. So anyway, if you look at the number 318, 318 is the number of the name Eleazar. When you add up the letters of his name, you get 318. And so then you're like, okay, well, that's interesting. And Eleazar was the head slave. He was like the head servant. He was the house-born son. So the idea that he was born of the house is a concept that's in ancient times, especially in ancient Hebrew times, where if you didn't have your own son, that doesn't mean that Eleazar was Abraham's son. It means he was the son of the house, meaning that Abraham's household adopted Eleazar as a son. And so he was adopted as a son and as the heir, actually, of Abraham. If Abraham didn't have any other children, if you remember this, remember when God came to Abraham and said, hey, I'm going to be a shield to you and your protector. And Abraham's like, where's my kid? If you don't give me this kid that you promised me 10 years ago, I'm going to have to give everything I own to Eleazar. So what does it matter if you're making these promises, but you're not following through? Anyway, God's like, all right, okay, I hear you. Well, your sons are going to be kings and they're going to possess the whole land. And, he kind of sweetens the promise, but still doesn't follow through for another, 10 or 15 years. So Abraham waited a lot. But in the meantime that he was waiting, he actually took his 318 men, and Eleazar would have been the captain of those men, the men of his house, to go and do this, super sweet Delta Force mission to rescue Lot from the forces of Chedorlaomer. And and they won. And so there's an idea that the army was the army almost represented Eleazar as the force of Abraham's house. That's the idea that a lot of scribes will say, that the reason the number is the same as Eleazar's name is it's sort of like the army was, like Eleazar was the captain of the army, and the army was representative of Eleazar's faithfulness and his strength under Abraham. Anyway, I don't know, maybe. Absolutely, actually, total speculation there. But I guess what I'm saying is that Moses is such a specific writer. He's such a detailed writer, and his assessments of these things are so precise that people will speculate about everything. If there's a number that's mentioned or a word choice or anything like that, and it's usually worth speculating about because Moses is a brilliant writer, and most everything he's writing is worth investigating. Anyway, so that's that. Oh, hi, Lisa. Okay, so that's good probably for that. If you want to hear more about creation or anything else, you can let me know. I've done probably enough controversial stuff today, but I can do more if you guys want. Okay. I don't know if there's a delay or whatnot, so if there is, I don't know. But I think that's probably good for today. And next about two weeks from now, I am going to do another one of these. So every other Wednesday, we're going to have that. And I hope that these are useful. I'm trying to get better at this, but I also don't know what I'm doing. So there's that. But I'm getting better. All right. I will talk to you soon, and I should be able to release another episode of the Lord's Prayer, the intro to tomorrow. I'm hoping to release it tomorrow. I've got most of the prep work done on it, and that would be good, and I'm excited about that. So thanks everybody for joining that did, and I will talk to you all later.